Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Josh. Great to be here with you. Yeah, like you say, I've done quite a lot for quite a long time now. I've got the grey hairs to show for it as well. But look, I was like any other sort of young person, young lad that I grew up with. I was just desperate to be in the game. I was a okay young footballer. Managed to make my way around the professional clubs during my teenage years, and then I got a big opportunity to go out and play in New Zealand when I was 19, and I was over there for 3 years, and the opportunity to be full time, the opportunity to go and play at a good level with other players was fantastic. But I always knew that I wanted to kind of stay in the game. Always had a realization that I wasn't going to go on playing for Wolves or anything like that. All my sort of big dreams. So I was desperate to stay in the game, and I'd done a business degree whilst I was playing, and really, had that desire. And then, strange moment, really. I was actually on my way back to the UK from New Zealand, and my parents used to send me packages across it. There'd be a couple of Wolves programs, maybe a copy of the Express and Star, and my dad also worked in football, and he used to get this magazine called FC Business, and then that was in there. And I remember reading it on the way home on the plane, and realizing that they were based in Gateshead, which is not too far from where I was going to be living. I ended up doorstepping them when I got back, and had a really positive chat, saying, "Oh, look, you're a football business magazine, and I've got a business degree. I've just finished playing overseas. Maybe this is a good connection." And that got me started. Really, I very quickly got a bit of luck and found myself as editor, and then was there for 7 years. Right at the point, you took in 2005, 2006, where prior to that, no one was really talking about football business. And even in that period, it was really only ourselves, Martin Samuel a little bit, David Conn a little bit, but nowhere near the presence of what it was now. People didn't know who the chief execs of clubs were. Okay, you might know who the owner is or something like that, but had nowhere near the presence that it does now. And on a personal level, I got very lucky in the sense of, in that position, I was able to build up an unbelievable network of all the owners, all the chief execs, all the key influences in all the clubs, associations, stakeholders, right through an interesting time. So 2008, credit crunch, and then started to observe how this thing called football was different, how it had a sense of immunity around it, and really started to think of some of the reasonings why that might be. And I think at the time, really, I was probably the only person in the country that had that kind of like helicopter view of what was going on. So one day I might be at Watford and see something really good, something really best practice that they're doing, and the next day I might be at Sunderland and they're not doing what Watford are doing, but they're doing something else that Watford aren't doing. And so I was able to kind of build up this picture of, what kind of like good look like, or at least what interesting looked like. And really it got to the point then when, as you know yourself, people start to come to you for advice, for opinion. And I knew at some point I would have to go and get into a club, and actually, rather than sort of pontificate from the outside, go and actually do this for real. And after a sort of deviation over into the Netherlands, I did that, and I became chief exec at Stockport County, which was it changed my life really, to be honest, because it was probably the toughest experience of my life. The club had recently come out of an administration they really shouldn't have come out of, if I'm being absolutely honest. And I think sometimes football clubs are afforded the luxury of, not facing liquidation because of the realities of what a club is. But it certainly wasn't the clean slate that most reincarnations are. And I made a lot of mistakes, to be honest, Josh. When I look back, I was definitely naive to perhaps what I thought I knew. But what I'm certain of is that it was a sort of crystallizing experience in terms of understanding what the club is and what people think the club is. And what I mean by that is some of the stakeholders that we define as the club. And to be honest, I think include supporter bases and things like that. These things that we wrap up in cotton wool that can't do any harm. That's not the reality. That's not the reality. And what I realised at Stockport, there were some good people there when I was first there, but after they left, what I realised was that this thing called the football club that couldn't manifest itself and say, "Oh, you're hurting me here," or "Stop doing that." That was solely on my shoulders. And then that juxtaposition of realizing that what you have been led to believe success looks like, which actually is still exists today. Winning games is success. Not winning games is failure. Is not the whole picture. So the ability to keep that club solvent, keep that club a going concern, I viewed as a massive success. Now I know that period, not only myself, but the other people that were involved were perhaps not viewed as a success, but really also that reality really then got me started off a road of exploring, researching, and understanding the nature of fandom, which has become my kind of area of expertise and interest. It gave me that opportunity. I wouldn't have gone down the road that I've gone down if I hadn't have had those experiences at Stockport. And I've got to tell you, I think that they've done an absolutely unbelievable job in the past few years. I think the owner is absolutely tremendous. And I know Simon, the now chief exec, who I think is a really good operator. And the circumstances in which they exist now gives the opportunity for playing success, and fantastic, absolutely brilliant. But my experiences where playing success perhaps was less of a option really did enlighten me to this idea of the governing dynamics of fandom that I'm so interested and passionate and obviously researching about today. So after that, I've worked in many clubs, been involved in player development, coach development, lots of research, mainly on the nature of fandom, and we've sort of crescendo to this point now. We're on the verge of this regulator, where I think that for myself, it's a kind of natural sort of crystallization of everything that I've been talking and thinking about, and certainly over the past couple of years, how I've refined some of that, because this is a pivotal time. It's a momentous time in what's going on in the game, and it won't be news to anybody that I'm not overly supportive of the notion of a regulator, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I think football in this country and fandom in this country is much more fundamental than what it is given credit for, and we need to have a bit of a sit back and have a real think about what it is that we want from this game before we start making any big structural changes to its future direction.
Apologies for taking you away from the podcast, but this will be really quick. We've launched our football business community. What that is everyone that's a guest on this podcast is part of this community. So if you would like to network with our guests, this is the place to do so. We have a live Q&A with every podcast guest on, so you can ask your questions rather than just listening to mine. If it's something that sounds interesting to you, there's a discount code in the description below. Use it, click the link, join the community. Right, that's all for me. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's really key. We just, if people watch the previous episode with Daniel Plumley, we were just discussing this in terms of what does the independent regulator define as success, and there's a lot of turns around sort of like sustainability. Well, what is sustainability? What does that mean for football club? What does that mean for individual football clubs? You were just reflecting on your time at Stockport there, and it was a case of success for you wasn't necessarily achievable on the pitch. So it was a case of like, it's almost like in terms of the ranking order of how we define success, actually on pitch success was something that almost went a couple runs down the ladder, because the immediate focus was sort of financial sustainability and just keeping the club afloat day to day. And I think understanding that picture for each of the individual clubs is really important, and sort of like transparency around that. Do you think that at the moment there's a good enough understanding of how, like, what are the sort of definitions around these words for each individual clubs? I don't think we've heard much. I feel like everyone's using these generic terms, but no one's actually defining what these words mean.
I think this question of what do we want from football in this country is it's a big philosophical discussion. That requires people to abandon the sort of prerequisite thoughts that they are existing in day to day, mainly because a lot of those dispositions are not opinions based upon critical analysis of oneself. People think like that because they just automatically have, because they exist in this country at this particular time, under this particular government, under this particular socio-economic system. And it's my view as as somebody that has devotes a lot of time into thinking about these things, that the ills that we see in football, the ills that we see in fandom, are inevitable symptoms of neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? The best definition that I've heard for what neoliberalism is capitalism's reaction to democracy. So neoliberalism is capitalism's reaction to democracy. Neoliberalism wants to promote competition within markets above everything else. Football is not immune to that. And the other isms that plague our society, such as materialism, is very much evident in the game. And in fact, football offers a window into the temperature of our economy, the way that people feel about the place that they're from, the relationship that they're having with the place that they're from, and most importantly, how they feel about themselves, better than any other interaction with any other commercial business that exists within our economy. There's a limited amount to glean about the nature of localism from Sainsbury's or Asda or Morrison's. But there's something very fundamental to glean out of the information that's available about how we interact with our local football clubs. And just my thinking has sort of moved to a more sort of macro approach, really, in terms of how we should be thinking about football clubs. And football clubs, it's not new to say, oh, they're an important part of the community or anything like that. I'm trying to say it's actually much more fundamental than that. It's actually much more of a basic resistance to neoliberalism than what is perceived. So church attendance disappearing in this country, Church of England, pretty much on course to disappear over the next 25 years. Trade union membership nowhere near what it was 30, 40 years ago. So fandom, football club fandom, it's the last act of large scale collectivism in this country. Yet we treat it as something separate. We treat it as something separate, as the ultimate hobby or anything like that, rather than actually a fundamental expression of how we define civic pride, localism. It's the only tradition. It's the only tradition that I would say 99% of people have left to mold in their lives. The only thing I have to pass on to my kids in the form of a tradition is that I'm a Wolves fan. My dad was a Wolves fan, come from 100 years of Wolves fans, and they're now Wolves fans. And the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, talks about tradition as not something that is about fossilizing something that's happened, but actually a tradition being a living thing that gives you the opportunity to mold the next bit. And I think that's really interesting, because the death of intergenerational support is cataclysmic within our games. And this is something that people can observe on the street. You can be in the streets of Durham, where I am here, and people are walking about in, do you know what? It's not even Man City, Liverpool tops. It's Real Madrid. It's teams from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And that social breakdown. That's social breakdown. That is materialism on steroids. So how should we be thinking about what clubs are, and what that foundational point should be for what regulation should look like? At the moment, I wouldn't say we're even 25% of the sort of seriousness of where we should be, and I certainly don't think there's anyone in government at the moment, certainly not this Labour government, that although branded up as this sort of like left-leaning entity, has been acting in a more neoliberalistic way than its conservative predecessor gives validity to. And I think that's what I'm really trying to fight for now, in the sense of we have an opportunity with football to do something very good in this country, and I think some of the decisions that are going to be made over the near future are going to be structurally important to that. But at the moment, we are only talking about the symptoms of the problem rather than the causation.
Yeah, I think there's loads to unpack there. I think the one thing that's sort of striking me is, like, with this sort of holistic overview and this sort of high level thinking, from that sort of process, what sort of tangible lessons or what sort of tangible value does this bring to clubs, stakeholders, talking government. Like if we were able to sort of capture this, succinctly express it, and be able to really unpack what it means to be a fan, what it means to connect with your local community, and rebuild these ties, and try to bring back the traditions of following your family in terms of support and all the rest of it. And we talked about sort of causation. One of the things that obviously is the main driver of causation is media. And the reason for that is because I'll put it out there. I'm a son of a glory hunter. I should be a Wolves fan. My great granddad played in goal for the Wolves, but my dad grew up in the era of Kenny Dalglish, Ian Rush, and saw that as success. And my dad grew up as a Liverpool fan.
Yeah.
And he shouldn't have been, but he was. And obviously I grew up with it being a Liverpool fan because my dad was a Liverpool fan. And obviously I had sort of like Istanbul happen at a relatively young age. So then obviously that sort of those sort of moments sort of like go, okay, this is, I get this. I understand why this is so amazing, and like why.
Yeah.
So there's loads to unpack there. But
I'll just jump in there because do you know what? I don't see it as government seeing it as in their interests to fix this situation, because ultimately, I guess ultimately what I'm saying is that football as the last act of large scale collectivism is actually the last kind of hope of resistance, really, against a type of neoliberalism that not that we're approaching, but that we exist in. Best coined by the economist Mark Fisher, who wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, which is really this sort of nihilistic look at what it is to exist as an individual as an individual within this sort of uber capitalistic regime. I think I'd be naive to say that there is a kind of undertone out of government that we want to observe what the real opportunity of football is and kind of put structures in place to help that, because ultimately I think what that would lead to is what that should lead to is a resistance against the neoliberalism and the neoliberal politics that we are all being subjected to at the moment, and it's such a large topic. It's hard to know exactly where to start and where to finish. But I think the best one I've found is that the first thing that we have to do is all realize that this thing that we call fandom is, the idea of it is a cradle to the grave experience.
Yeah.
But how we actually treat it is a 1 year experience 80 times. So, what I like to talk about, which is the opportunity of fandom. What is the opportunity of fandom? The opportunity of fandom is best consumed as a cradle to the grave experience. Okay. So, within that, you could quite quickly get quite philosophical. Well, how do you know what success feels like? How do you know what good feels like? You only know what good feels like if you know what bad feels like. You only know what success feels like if you've got an experience of failure. And in many ways, jumping right ahead, for me, what is the answer to the question of what's the opportunity of fandom? It's very similar to the question of what's the opportunity of life. The opportunity of fandom is ultimately to experience all the emotions that are on offer from existence: joy, hate, despair, anguish, love. That is what is on offer. That is what is on offer. And I've got to tell you, I was at a funeral a couple of years ago, and something happened in that funeral, And by the way, isn't it really strange that weddings, funerals, we attach our fandom to those moments? You know, lots of people either get buried in their shirt or their scarf or whatever. Really fundamental. But at this funeral I was at, when they referred to the person that had died, their fandom, it was just a sentence that it just loved going to the game with their brothers. What they didn't do was read through a list of Wolves didn't say, oh, during their lifetime, Wolves, you know, broke the transfer record, bringing Raul Jimenez in. They've got a record points tally in the Premier League or anything like that. So it's this idea that when we reflect on our fandom, and I've asked a lot of sort of older supporters, when they reflect on their fandom, they do it so in this really like holistic way, which is a sort of overarching look back of the things, the sentiment. But in like the living years, we're treating our clubs increasingly poorly. And we've got to take some responsibility in how we approach our fandom. And, you know, this is a great time of the season to be having this conversation, Josh, because there are some clubs that are over the moon, right? Some clubs that are experiencing that big dopamine high. You know, you look at the scenes in Bradford. I think Bradford have been down in League Two for 12 years or something ridiculous like that, quite a long time. So they're on absolute cloud nine, probably having a bit of a better experience of what that feels like because of the last 12 years. And then you've got other clubs that, you know, are frustrated, that, you know, want the owner gone, want the manager gone. And again, you know, I appreciate what I'm saying is, you know, not immediately deliverable. I don't want to say the word not naive, because I think there is you've got to have hope that we can shift perception. But this is one season in an 80-year relationship. You know, this is the longest relationship you're going to have in your life. It's going to outlive your marriage. It's going to outlive your relationship with your kids. There's no other longer relationship that you're gonna have. And you know, we've got to, rather than being the good little neoliberals that we've all been tuned in to become, which is to promote more, you know, change, you know, instant gratification. I wrote a piece a few years ago about the sort of swipe generation. You know, you don't like the song, swipe, you know, swipes, skip. You know, what about actually, if you've had a bad season, actually, this is going to give me the experience of when we don't have a bad season, to be able to live that moment more in the moment, in a more fulfilling, meaningful way. And you know, this is the opportunity. This is the opportunity that football fandom should and could be delivering. But there's so many things within it that don't allow that fundamental opportunity to actually manifest at the moment.
No, okay. So again, it's all, you know, it's a real clear sort of picture on how the sort of the world is operating at the moment, let alone football. What do you think are sort of like the steps in which football clubs can take in order to sort of start the ball moving in the right direction? Like what sort of things is it in the way in which they're messaging to fans in this? Is it just the experience they deliver on a match day? What is it? What can clubs tangibly do to start this process?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the idea of like fan engagement is, you know, at FC Business, we were one of the first to start talking about fan engagement as the sort of phrase was, and the phrase has been ultimately, it's been kind of like bastardized by marketeers, really, is what has happened. So, you know, a quick search on Google of like fan engagement, and you'll see, you know, pints that pour themselves in like 2 seconds, and fan experience has been amalgamated into fan engagement, and again, it's a kind of like dilution of the bigger opportunity. Ultimately, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to look at who are the outliers. Actually, who are clubs that have a different way of doing things, a different relationship with their fan base, and is that achievable in a large scale rollout? And the easiest go-to example is Atletico Bilbao, who I'm not even sure they're a football club. I think I think there's a question mark over whether they're a football club. I mean, their actual political ideologies have softened over recent years, but the notion, if you go onto the website, the notion's still there that the promotion of an independent Basque state. I'm sure people know that you have to be from the Basque region in order to play for Bilbao. And so what that means is the degrees of separation from fan to player is unbelievably low. They went to the same school as you. Their dad works with their dad. They're from the same neighborhood of you. And there's so much research around how social identification as a kind of means to loyalty, and again, loyalty has gone through the same destruction of meaning as what the word fan engagement has, as well. I can speak on that if you would like, but Bilbao fans, and of which I've met and spoke to many, have a genuine different experience of fandom to what I do as a Wolves fan, or what my pals do as Forest fans or Luton fans, or whatever. They are responsible for the upbringing of the team that they're watching and the future teams that their children are going to be watching. They play a fundamental role in that. I have played no role in this Wolves team. I have no contribution to the formation of that team. In fact, I don't think Wolves have got even an English player in the starting 11 now. There is no notion of my club being a reflection of the Black Country. It's a set of transient individuals that limit the meaning of my fandom. So, but to answer your question, there's some real life examples of where it can be done, and the first act that is required is a bit of bravery, because the people inside the clubs will go, oh well, we just can't do, we can't just go and play 7 Black Country lads. We'll get relegated. Well, okay. What you have to do then is at least be straight with everybody to say, in a way, we're selling our soul in order to preserve this plastic form of success. And is everyone comfortable with that, or actually do people want a more meaningful experience to their fandom? I tell you what, if there was a referendum at Wolves and they said 7 of the 11 were going to be Black Country players, but look, it might mean that we get relegated, I would vote for that in a heartbeat. And do you know what it is just the club that does it domestically and has the bravery to do it, like, wow. What will happen is the club that nails that right, okay, and that has some sort of at least minimum playing success with it, that will start a fire for other fans realizing what I'm getting served up is a dish of materialism on a plate of neoliberalism. Okay, and I am a mere sort of conduit of consumer in order to keep feeding that beast. I think we've kidded ourselves to say that we've taken big steps with fan engagement and dialogue. It's all on the outside. It's all on the edges. Okay, it's not at the fundamental level. It's not in social identification. It's not about things being a reflection of the place that they are from. And those are the steps that some brave clubs could take. Look, we used to have two. We used to have two in Britain. Celtic and Rangers used to be reflections of the ideologies of the place. And obviously, I'm not a fan of sectarianism. Of course, I'm not, right? But the experience of fans during that period was a more real and intense experience to the one, inevitably to the one that is now delivered now. It has to be. It can't not be. Celtic were populated with Catholic players. Rangers were populated with sort of royalist Protestant players, and that was the essence of the experience. And whilst both fan bases obviously still carry that, it's really important for how social identification works, that the thing that you're reflecting onto, i.e. the team, is of a reflection of that. And all clubs have got those like local heroes that are the embodiment of that. But when you start to look at player tenure, when you start to look at the frequency of proper testimonials as it was when I was growing up, it's frightening. Player tenure off the chart, local player tenure even more off the chart. And we've got to ask ourselves some bigger questions of what that means in the kind of fight against the homogenization of all our towns and cities. It reflects perfectly onto the state of the high street. All the high streets, they're just homogenized. I could send you a picture, you wouldn't know which high street you are because it's the same set of shops. And this is what has happened to our clubs. They have fell victim to the realities of neoliberalism, and fighting back is very hard, but we've at least got to have the conversation about it when big things like the regulator rear their head.
No, I can't agree more. I think the main thing that sort of clubs grapple with from this point, from a sort of a financial point of view, is the balance between appealing to global markets and global fan bases as well as local. I think, but I feel like it's a bit of a miss, because the reason why clubs have such strong brands is because they're so connected. Like, the reason why you'd want to go to Anfield is for the atmosphere of the Kop, and the reason why there's an atmosphere in the Kop is because it's reflection of the community. And I think it's like you say, as you go around the stadiums, it's not just the attendances might be the same, but the atmospheres are getting quieter and quieter because of there isn't that connection to the clubs.
And Liverpool's a great example, and the loss of Trent of Liverpool is more meaningful in the sense of, you might be able to correct me, but there's no other you've got nobody there of longevity now, of like serious longevity of sort of locality. The midfielder, I forget his name now, he's Scouse as well, but gone are the days where Liverpool were fielding sort of 6, 7, 8 Scousers, and that's the same, and not just Liverpool, kind of like all all clubs. But you know, the breakdown of demographics in stands in stadiums now as well, Josh, as you know very well, is certainly in the Premier League, whilst gross attendances are high, and that's great on one hand, that mix of local fan base versus corporate fan base or whatever is something that, you know, what I'm saying is I'm not saying we've got to stop it. I'm saying we've got to understand it. We've got to understand what the implications are. What are the unintended consequences of it? And on the losses one, football clubs choose their losses.
Yeah.
So football clubs are in a privileged position to any other business. If you could go to the boss of Sainsbury's and say, plus or minus 5%, I'm going to tell you what your revenue is going to be for the next 12 months, they would snap your hands off. They would snap your hands off. And that's the position football clubs are largely in on a kind of annual basis. So this idea that it's kind of like market pressures that fuel losses is, yes, it's the narrative. It's fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. There is no one putting a gun to the head of anybody to say you have to sign him or her on these wages. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. There's nothing to say that you have to do it. So you know, losses are absolutely optional. Yeah, and they'll go, oh yeah, but then we're going to get relegated. Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I'm not saying that clubs should abandon signing players and get all the youth. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we've arrived at this position without having a meaningful conversation about what the unintended consequences of reaching this position is. And what I'm saying is that my experience of fandom is a lesser one to the one that my dad had, which was in turn perhaps a lesser one than what his dad had, and onwards. And so how comfortable are we with that, and how comfortable are we with that will continue for our kids and their kids? I feel uncomfortable that walking the streets of Durham, I see PSG, Barcelona tops. I don't want to see that. I want to see the tops in the places that they're meant to be. Okay, I want to see Newcastle tops. I want to see Sunderland tops. I want to see Middlesbrough tops. That's what I want to see. The notion of civic pride is a wider, bigger issue. Labour were slightly interested in towns for a very short period whilst they were out of power, but there's nothing in the policy making to revive this idea of localism. Cameron had a policy called Big Society, and I remember having the ear of the sports minister at the time, and how it was, and it was a failed policy, and it was doomed to be a failed policy. Why would someone in Carlisle be interested in something that's going on in Plymouth when Carlisle can't fill their own stadium? People don't care enough about where they're from, never mind a sort of wider, more nationalistic view. And ultimately, a shift to this way of thinking would be one of the biggest acts of positivity for the creation of social capital that we could do in this country. Working towards a situation where clubs were back to being a reflection of the towns and cities from which they exist would be one of the best policies that we could make for take the whole host of socioeconomic factors that you want to measure. Josh, we've got the indices of deprivation coming out later on this year, and it'll be another absolute horror show for the direction of this country. And for me, at the core of it is the death of localism, the death of civic pride, the lack of social capital that exists within our communities. And it's only football that's got the both infrastructure and scale of collectivism that can harness any kind of positive movement in that. So that's what the regulators should be thinking about. That's what we should be really interested in. But really, it's almost an issue for, you know, the Department of Health, you know, or the Treasury. You know, this is this is where this kind of thinking should belong. But we've diminished what football is in this country to such an extent that we're just a fully fledged part of the economy, and you know, we're treating our clubs the same way as what we do our kind of purchases. And that's something to be absolutely mournful about. You know, I wrote about it, about how, you know, the day that this regulator got momentum, arguably one of the saddest days in this country's, you know, life. You know, football is our national game. We've now got nothing that's organic. Okay, so we can't, as a society, we can't muster anything that is just of ourselves. We have to ruin everything. We have to ruin it to the point where we're saying, oh, we need someone to regulate this behavior. But as I said, we're not regulating the causation. We're simply looking at the symptoms.
I think it's spot on. I think the one thing that is I'm trying to think ways in which to sort of give more for those, if you're working at a football club right now and you're thinking more from a, I don't know, a business like side of it. If you've got a business rather than like a social duty head, if you're unfortunately, if you're in a position that you're working in the club and don't have that sort of, you know, connection to the community, and your objective isn't necessarily just to drive, you know, social connection. It's they just want to try to raise revenue, try and look at it as a business case and go like, look, how do I make more money? Well, if we get more international fans in per head, the international fans are spending more per head. Therefore, I'm going to target these fan bases, and it will help us grow internationally. Blah 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 blah. Bring more commercial opportunities, local sponsors in different countries, etc. etc. Is this a case of just a different way of selling and marketing? Because I feel like the wider vision of this is still, if someone nails this, they win the business case, they win the business argument if they can do it effectively, if they can rebuild the local support and the local fan base, and they can rebuild that identity and they rebuild that brand, I think they win the business side of this. So is this a case of people in football clubs at the moment don't know how to effectively monetize? I know this is like the business side of looking at this, but effectively monetize the local fans and connect. They can't connect with the local fans or drive enough value to the local fans. And it's easier for them to provide value to international fans, and therefore they get more financial reward because they provide more value to the international fan. Is it a case of they simply don't know how to provide enough, like, more value to the local supporter?
It's such a good question that Josh. Let me kind of break it down. So first of all, how we've got all the clubs set up, it's not their fault. It's not their fault how they operate. Okay, so we operate in a pure Adam Smith version of economics. Okay, individual ambition serves the common good. Okay, so we've got all the clubs looking out for themselves. Okay, I need to do this. We need to more commercial revenue because we need to get to go on what? Bet players for what? To win. So we've got all this individual ambition in a reality where we can only exist ourselves if our competitors also exist.
Yeah.
If Sainsbury's go out of business, that's great for Asda. Asda don't care. Brilliant. Amazing. So we need to shift. Again, I'm speaking from a sort of utopian standpoint. I don't think this is a reality. We need to shift from this Adam Smith perspective of economics, individual ambition serves the common good, to a John Nash version of economics, where doing what's best for yourself and the group serves the common good the best, you have to have someone to play. Josh, it can't be Liverpool versus Liverpool. It can't be Manchester United against Manchester United. We have to have a paradigm shift in the psyche of everyone in the game, that the idea of individual ambition serves the common good is nonsense. It's nonsense. And the strength of the pyramid, the meaning within the pyramid is this sort of fabric that keeps kind of hope alive. There's nothing fundamental stopping anybody having the experience of success, but we must stop diminishing the value of non-success, of non-playing success. There is huge meaning, an experiential opportunity in non-playing success. It gives rise to a genuine feeling of playing success when it eventually comes along. And if you're giving yourself 80 years properly to do it, there's a chance that it could come along. I got hammered in the local press for saying this, but you know, Stockport had been relegated, and Man City had won the Premier League, and I stand by it today. You know, those county fans that were so amazing that season, they had a more real experience of fandom than in many ways what City fans had done, which was a kind of world 11, winning the Premier League on the back of large-scale international investment. And whilst, look, it was a horrible experience, no one wants to have that kind of experience. I tell you what, the experience that county fans have now in their playing success, and speak to many of them still, is absolutely meaningful, especially for the ones that were there in the non-playing success moments as well. It's yin and yang. You know, why do I know that this little symbol's white here? Because I know what black looks like. You know, it's that contrast of where we must go. But to go back to your question, we must divorce ourselves from this idea that the singular version of success is playing success. We have to go through that paradigm shift. And you know what, just most teams are where they've always been. If you look at the all-time cumulative average positions, most teams are where they've always been. Yet we have this ambition. We have this ambition to be somewhere where we've not always been, to quench what thirst, to this sort of existential dopamine hit that is fulfilling something that is separate to what the football club is. And you know, I've got some big thoughts on this, especially for, you know, some more of the deprived areas and the swing of attendances. It's more a reflection on how people feel about themselves. So as clubs, we have to go through this paradigm shift of stopping to prioritize playing success as the singular definition of success of fandom, and actually prioritize the most meaningful possible cradle to the grave experience that we can have, one in which legitimizes and makes the fan participatory in what goes on. I refer back to the Bilbao fans. The Bilbao fans are participatory in the playing success or non-success of their team. Our domestic fans are not participatory, at all. Yes, they make a contribution, financial contribution. Yes, playing in empty stadiums is horrible and boring, and no one wants that. And I'm not trying to diminish the role of the fan here as well. I'm not trying to do that in any shape or form. In fact, to the contrary, I feel that what I talk about and what only a few other people talk about is that's trying to emancipate the experience of the fan, but more on the side of the fan than what appears. I want to go through my lifetime experience of being a Wolves fan, for it helping to shape how I feel about myself, how I feel the time I spent with my kids, the values, the essence, the history of where we originate from, and I want players to be reflections of that. You know, people talk about Bull, you know, being a sort of legend at Wolves because of the goals he took. Bull's a legend to me because he was a identifier of what hard work looked like, of what loyalty looked like. You know, he could have had opportunities to go elsewhere, didn't want to stay at Wolves. He was an identifier of what desire. When I was growing up, the teachers would refer to, like, what would Steve Bull say? What would Steve, and it meant something. It meant something. What would Steve Bull do? And it I don't think that those references really exist now, and we're a lesser society for it. So really the paradigm shift is about what type of society do we want to exist in? Do we want to, and look, it's not for that 100% not for me or any individual to decide, but in order to have a fair fight of answering the question, we at least need to awaken to the reality that we're in now, and not this mirage that we're in, where all clubs think that, all fan bases think that they've should have the right or should have the desire to this to win games. No, for all fan bases, the opportunities exist in the highs and the lows, because that's the inevitability, and that's life, isn't it, Josh? You know, like, life is high and lows, and you know, we have an epidemic of young people that lack robustness and have emotional issues. You go and support your local club. You'll have really safe doses of high and low emotion, really safe little doses of disappointment. And guess what? You can go back next week and act on it. And you know, this is what we should be subscribing. This is what we should be doing with our time. But neoliberalism doesn't want us to do that on a Saturday afternoon. It wants us to go out shopping at Poundland.
No, I think that's a really, really great place to sort of circle off our chat. I think it's taken us full circle from your time at Stockport and sort of defining success. Like, the one thing that as soon as you went in, your sort of definition of success quickly changed from we need to win all these games to actually we need to define what this actually means for success at this moment, and what is our number one priority.
Yeah, and do you know what, Josh? It's the first time that I've ever really spoken about that at Stockport, because, you know, I've got to say, like, I absolutely made some mistakes at the start, but if I didn't make those mistakes, like, I wouldn't have had the experience of then knowing what to do. So, you know, if I went back, would I have said some of the things that I've said? Would have done, like probably not. Probably not. And I think you've got to be big enough to hold your hands up on that. But ultimately, you know, this thing called a football club, you know, what is it? You know, it's something that can't manifest and speak for itself, is an absolute certainty. So there has to be individual or individuals that within there that, as a minimum, don't drop the baton. And you know, that's just the absolute basic, the basic number one that we should be looking for out of all ownership is, look, you might have playing success, you might not have playing success, but you have to not drop the baton. Okay, the club has to continue to exist. And And for most fans, they're going to live through multiple different ownerships. And I kind of look at my own experience at Wolves now. I'm saying, well, my support is going to outlive the current ownership. Touch wood. And that in itself gives rise to a new opportunity of what the future might look like as well. But it's a big idea. It's a paradigm shift that's required. And if I was reaching out to Lisa and Andy or anyone else, I've thought hard and long about this. There's some elements of the regulator that I think could be really effective. I'm really uncomfortable about the idea of say we get up to like 14, 15 American owners in the Premier League, is there a disposition there to say, oh, we're going to maybe have a bit more of an American model? We wouldn't want that. Saying that looks like some promotion and relegation, and a bit more jeopardy is going to happen over in the USL. So maybe that's not a fair thing to say about the ownership. So there might be some basic protection measures for how our pyramid works. But beyond that, we need a much more fundamental discussion about what it is that we're trying to regulate. Are the problems that we're saying actually the problems, or are they symptoms of a bigger problem, which is what I'm hypothesizing is the case? And if that is the case, then there needs to be a much larger discussion with as many eminent, interesting people as possible to get to a consensus of what policy then looks like. And the thing is, like I mentioned, like in the funeral piece, is that fans deep down want this. If you ask a fan, do you want 5 or 6, 7 of the 11 to be from the place that your club is? The answer's never no. It's, oh no, I wouldn't want that. The answer's always yes. We still have an instinct for our clubs to be reflections of the place that we're from. There is still an underbelly within our fan base that is protective over the pyramid. We saw that with the Super League. It was a refreshing reaction to that. We need to galvanize whatever is left, whatever neoliberalism hasn't destroyed, to revive and create a renaissance in the social reflections of what our clubs look like. Look, I don't know if it's possible. Maybe we're too far gone. But I'm interested in sort of continuing that conversation. And I think, like you say, if you ask yourself or you ask other fans, do you want your club to be more of a reflection of where you're from, and do you want it to stand up for the issues that you're having in a local sense? The answer is always yes. And I think whilst that's the case, we should be trying to push for more of that.
Absolutely. Well, Ran, it's been absolutely great having you on. Really interesting discussion. I think there's loads of key takeaways, and let's hope there's a club listening to this who really buy into it and decide, you know what, we're going to be the club number one, and we're going to really dive into trying to rebuild what our local identity is, rebuild local pride, and set the precedent. So that's the challenge to any club listening. The other thing is as well, for those who have got this far in the conversation, we are not only a podcast where we sort of share ideas, we also want to grow a network. So what we do is we host a live Q&A with each of our podcast guests for you guys to get involved, ask your own questions, and really dive deep into the areas that you're most interested in. If that is something that you'd like to do, there'll be a link in the description below. And yeah, thanks again for listening. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Josh.